Since you'll have the opportunity to talk about your later work in other screenings this weekend, including up to your most recent film, Dark Glasses, I thought we could start tonight, since we've all just seen The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, by talking about how this came to be your remarkable first feature. It remains a major film. I think it's one of the great debuts, and as you suggested in your introduction, it's impossible not to see the influence that it's had on films that have followed in its path. And so I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about how this idea, how this screenplay became the film that you had to direct, because it was not the first film that you wrote.
Sì, è complicato perché prima io facevo lo sceneggiatore e pensavo che tutta la vita avrei fatto lo sceneggiatore. Ho scritto anche un film per Sergio Leone con Bernardo Bertolucci, c'era una volta il West. Insomma, era una professione che mi piaceva. Mi piaceva essere solo nella stanza e scrivere, e pensare, immaginare. Non mi piaceva invece il set perché c'erano 100 persone che parlano, chiacchierano, fanno casino, non mi piaceva molto. Quindi io, il fatto che sono diventato regista è un caso, perché non dovevo fare il regista.
It's kind of complicated to explain. I had been a screenwriter. I thought that's what I was going to be all my life. And in fact, one example, I wrote a screenplay together for Sergio Leone, together with Bernardo Bertolucci, Once Upon a Time in the West. And it's a profession that I really liked. I worked alone in a room, writing, thinking, imagining. And I thought that's what I was going to be doing for the rest of my life. And I didn't like the idea of being on a set where there were like hundreds of people talking, carrying on. So I only became a director really by accident.
E poi ho scritto questo film perché lo facesse un altro, naturalmente, perché io non volevo fare il regista. Però facendolo leggere ai produttori mi proponevano dei registi che secondo me non erano adatti perché non avevano capito che c'era qualcosa di nuovo in questo film. E allora improvvisamente, come un lampo, mi è venuta l'idea, allora lo faccio io come regista. Lo so, c'è la troupe, c'è tanta gente, fanno casino, chiacchierano, strillano, è un posto tremendo, però il film, se lo do a un altro, farà una schifezza, almeno provo a farlo io.
So I'd written this screenplay, with the idea that another director would do it. And the producers read it, and they started proposing different directors to me. And then I knew that all of them were wrong. They didn't realize that I'd written something new. And then suddenly, like this light bulb went off in my head, and I said, I'll do it. I didn't like being on the set. I knew there'd be a troupe there. Everyone would be talking, screaming, carrying on, and it would be just a terrible experience. But I decided to do it.
You mentioned thinking that you would be a screenwriter for most of your life, but prior to that you were a film critic. And I'd like to touch on that aspect of your life as it relates to this film especially, which I think is really important in how it quite cleverly references the cinematic past. You can think of Hitchcock and Bava, to name a couple in this film, but how it connects to your future as a filmmaker. I think so many ideas are laid out in this film that you'll continue to think about and rework in so many other films that will come after it. And so I'm just wondering if part of the motivation to direct this yourself was you seeing this as an extension of your film criticism or a response to the films that you had been seeing up to that point, either as a critic or as a screenwriter, seeing films that were getting made?
Sì, è stata molto importante. Io sì, avevo un mondo dentro di me grandissimo, di migliaia di film visti, fin da quando ero molto più giovane, che studiavo a Parigi. E, e quindi il pomeriggio andavo sempre alla Cinémathèque française a vedere i vecchi film, i film muti, i film dell'espressionismo, e ho cominciato ad amare il cinema. Mi piaceva ad esempio la Nouvelle Vague, adoravo la Nouvelle Vague, pensavo che era il cinema più interessante del mondo. I film western magnifici, i film di John Ford, i film di Howard Hawks, che sono poi gli autori amati più di tutti da John Carpenter, che adora John Ford e Howard Hawks. Anche io però li amo. E i film dell'espressionismo tedesco, insomma, i film di Ingmar Bergman, i film del grande Buñuel, i film del maestro Hitchcock. Quindi andavo a vedere tutti questi film e la notte andavo a letto ubriaco di film, di immagini. E così, quando poi ho fatto il cinema come regista, tutto questo mondo caotico mi è ritornato in mente, mi è ritornato e l'ho messo sullo schermo, così come veniva.
Being a film critic was a very important part of my formation because I was filled with this huge, gorgeous world. Ever since I had been very young, I studied in Paris, and every afternoon I would go to the Cinémathèque Française and see all kinds of movies, old movies, silent movies, films of German Expressionism. And I started to really love them. I love the films of the Nouvelle Vague, which I thought was such an interesting moment in cinema. I love the westerns of John Ford and of Howard Hawks, who, by coincidence, really are also the favorite directors of John Carpenter. He likes Ford and Hawks, and so do I. So I liked German Expressionism, the films of Ingmar Bergman, of Louis Buñuel, and of course of the great master of them all, Hitchcock. So I saw them, and every night I would go to bed drunk with films and images. So when I started to direct myself, this whole chaotic world came back into mind, and I put it up on the screen.
You've mentioned how formative it was for working with Leone and Bertolucci on Once Upon a Time in the West as a screenwriter, but did you have any formative encounters with filmmakers while you were a critic that taught you some aspect about filmmaking?
Sì, io ho avuto il piacere, l'opportunità di intervistare registi come Fritz Lang, con cui ebbi una lunga conversazione meravigliosa dove lui mi raccontò la sua vita, bellissima. Tanto che quando poi feci Suspiria, io presi l'attrice Joan Bennett, che era stata la sua donna, e speravo che mi raccontasse qualcosa di Fritz Lang. E lei mi disse: alla fine del film ti racconterò. E poi quando finì il film invece partì e non mi raccontò niente. E poi non so, ad esempio ho fatto una lunga intervista, ero molto giovane devo dire, avevo 20 anni, 21, una lunga intervista con John Huston, che è venuto in Italia per fare un film, La Bibbia. E mi ricordo che io non avevo appunto, perché lui non dava interviste. Allora, però sapevo che albergo stava. Sono andato in questo albergo e quando ho sentito, dice, portate questa cosa alla stanza del giornalista. Allora sapevo che stanza stava, che piano stava. Allora sono andato a questo piano, ho cominciato a percorrere tutto il piano e a un certo punto in una stanza d'angolo fuori c'erano un sacco di bottiglie di whisky, birra, pieno, era pieno. Io ho detto qui abita John Huston, sicuramente. E allora ho bussato e mi ha aperto lui che stava nudo con la vestaglia ed era mezzo ubriaco. Ed ebbi una bellissima intervista parlando in spagnolo, perché io parlavo bene lo spagnolo, lui pure, e quindi facemmo questa intervista in spagnolo. E tanti altri registi ho incontrato, tanti, grandi, piccoli, però importanti tutti, perché tutti raccontano storie della loro coscienza, del loro intimo, della loro profondità. I registi sono questo.
Yeah, when I was a film critic, I had the pleasure and the opportunity to interview a lot of really great directors. Fritz Lang, for example. We had a long and really wonderful conversation about life. And when I made Suspiria, I cast Joan Bennett, who had been his lover, in the hope that she would tell me a few things about Lang. And she said, when we're finished filming, I'll tell you something. But when we finished filming, she left and never told me anything. And then when I had a long interview when I was very young, only 20 or 21, with John Huston, who was in Italy to film the Bible. He was not a man who liked doing interviews, and he wouldn't come to them. But I knew the hotel that he was staying at. And so I went there, and I listened to what was being said, and then I overheard a waiter being told to bring this to the room of Mr. Huston. So I knew which floor he was on. So I went up there, and I walked up and down the hall, sort of listening, and there, in front of a corner room, there were tons of bottles, empty bottles of whiskey and of beer. And I said to myself, this is where John Huston is. So I knocked on the door, and he opened, and there he was, naked but in a bathrobe. And he gave me an interview, a fantastic interview, in Spanish, because I spoke Spanish, and so did he. And again, I had interviews with many, many other directors, great, not so great, but all of them important, because all of them tell stories. All of them have a kind of awareness of what they're doing. They talk about something very private and something very deep, because that's what directors do.
Well, then to bring it back to this feature, I mean, was it difficult developing this film? I'm just thinking about being a first-time filmmaker, working with this subject matter in early 70s Italy, which was not necessarily considered a peaceful time. It was one of political unrest, marked by terrorist activity as well. So I'm just wondering how difficult it was to get this film off the ground at the time.
Sì, ancora il terrorismo non c'era così forte, era appena nato, non era vero terrorismo, il terrorismo venne qualche anno dopo. No, però era difficile perché mancavano i soldi, però io avevo fatto una piccola fama come sceneggiatore. E allora mi conoscevano come sceneggiatore e si pensa che gli sceneggiatori potrebbero essere anche dei buoni registi. E così ho trovato un finanziatore che ha messo i soldi per fare il film. Però a metà film già si era pentito e voleva sostituirmi con un altro regista. E io fortunatamente, siccome il film l'avevo scritto io, lo producevo io, facevo tutto io, e ho detto no, non lo faccio, non lo do il film lo finisco io. E così è andata.
Well, terrorism. You know, the worst of terrorism had not happened yet. That was a few years later, but it had just sort of begun. The biggest problem was getting the money. But since I had somewhat of a reputation as a screenwriter, and screenwriters were thought of as people who could become good directors, I was able to find someone that would finance the film. But halfway into my making the movie, he regretted it, and he wanted to replace me with another director. But since I had written the script, since I had done all the work, I was a part producer, I said, absolutely not. I had to be the one to finish the film.
You mentioned your early reservations about eventually being on a film set, and so I'm curious what it was like once you finally arrived on set as the director for this film, because so much of what we see in this feature are decisions that were not at all safe ones to make. I mean, aside from the ways that you depict and stylize violence, you're also pulling off these remarkable technical sequences. I'm thinking about the opening sequence where Sam's in the vestibule between two panes of glass, or just the chase sequence with the Reginalder. So I'm curious just how you were able to convince yourself, convince the crew that was working with you that this is the film that you had to make.
Ma è semplice. A me non mi sembrava tanto difficile, mi sembrava molto semplice girare, fare film, immaginare le scene. Poi io sono stato abbastanza furbo, perché io ero debuttante e ho preso un direttore di fotografia che è diventato molto famoso poi naturalmente, ed era debuttante anche lui. Così io pensavo, loro vorrebbero mettermi un direttore di fotografia anziano che comanda lui, no? Dice fai così, fai così. Invece se io prendo uno debuttante, c'ha anche lui i suoi problemi, quindi non è che mi dirà quello come devo fare il film, ma cercherà di farlo come lo vogliamo fare insieme. E quindi questa è la storia.
Well, the thing is that I didn't see it as difficult. I just thought it would be easy. Doing the filming, imagining, putting images up on the screen. But I think I did something that was very clever. This was my beginner. I was a beginner as a director. This was my debut as a director. So for my director of photography, rather than take someone who was really senior and experienced, who would start bossing me around saying, no, this is how it's done, I also got someone as my DP who later became very famous, but was also in his first film. And that way, the two of us could be sort of experimenting together.
Well, I do want to talk about your crew, because I think this film is full of very important collaborations. I mean, you mentioned Vittorio Storaro. This is the first and only film that you'll work together, and it's his first color film, which I think is interesting. But there are a number of other people who work on this film that I think, I don't know, I would love to hear you reflect on. I mean, your father, with whom you'd work together for close to 2 decades, Ennio Morricone, who scored the film and will round out the other 2 films in your Animal trilogy, Franco Fraticelli, who will become a regular editor in your work. Yeah, so I'd be eager to hear you reflect on any of these collaborations, but I'm particularly interested in your experience working with Ennio Morricone, because I'm just wondering what you learned from that collaboration, given how important music becomes in your work, especially as it relates to your visual ideas.
Sì, io sapevo che la musica sarebbe stata una cosa molto importante nei miei film. Questo l'avevo imparato lavorando come sceneggiatore con Sergio Leone. E quindi ho preso lo stesso musicista che lavorava con Sergio e che era tra l'altro anche amico di mio padre. E così lui ha accettato di fare questo film di un debuttante. È stata... voi avrete visto, avete notato certe scene dove la musica sembra musica dodecafonica. In realtà è una musica improvvisata, perché Ennio Morricone col suo gruppo, lui suona la tromba, suonava, adesso non c'è più, suonava la tromba e gli altri suonavano e passava la scena, 10 minuti di film, e loro improvvisavano la musica che avete visto molte volte, appunto sembra musica dodecafonica, e invece perché era improvvisata, facevano insieme, si divertivano a inventare una musica diversa. Sì, poi c'era un montatore, sì, che ha lavorato con me per molti anni. Sì, però il montaggio per me non è una cosa importante, perché io giro che sembra già un film montato, non devo montare, non devo perdere tanto tempo a montarlo. Poi chi c'era? C'erano tante persone che erano nuove del cinema, perché appunto perché io avevo paura che mi volessero capito, fare come volessero loro il film. Invece io volevo fare il film come volevo io, come l'avevo pensato e come l'avevo immaginato. E quindi avevo preso delle persone anche degli amici, persone così, insomma anche appunto il direttore di fotografia, grande.
I knew that music was very important in films. I'd learned this in working, as a screenwriter for Sergio Leone, and there, of course, Ennio Morricone had done. I wanted him. He had done the scores for Sergio Leone, and he had also been a friend of my father for years. So he agreed to, do the music for this film by a beginning director. At some of the scenes, as you listen to the music, it might sound like dodecaphonic music, the 12-tone music, but it's not. It was improvised with, Ennio and his troupe. Ennio played the trombone, or he did play the trombone. But what we would do is we would show a scene, maybe on the screen for like 10 minutes, and then he and his troupe would improvise something. And so and so they really had a lot of fun just inventing something. So it might sound dodecaphonic, but instead it was improvised. And they had a lot of fun doing this. The editor is someone, yes, that I worked with for many years, but I actually don't think that editing is such an important part of my films, at least, because the way that I shoot, it's already sort of edited, and so we don't need to spend a lot of time on that. As for some of the other members of the troupe, like I said about the director of photography, many of them knew, some were friends, because I didn't want, a lot of very experienced people who would be trying to, boss me around and make the film the way they thought it should be made. I wanted to make the film the way I had written it, the way I had imagined it, the way that I wanted it.
We're running very short on time, so I just want to open it up to the audience for one or two questions. You can please raise your hand. There'll be a mic that'll come to you, so refrain from speaking until then. Yes, right here.
Hi. So I just want to say I've loved your film since I was a teenager. They mean so much to me, and one of the things that comes across in your work to me is your love of women. And one of my favorite things about this film is that the killer is a woman. And I would like to know, here in the United States, we have slasher films. The killer is always a man. Why, in your debut film, would you choose the killer to be a woman? And also, I guess, if you could please touch on I mean, there's like a love of women that comes across in all your films, and could you please talk about that?
Sì, questo è un tema molto, molto importante nei miei film, il tema della femminilità. Tutto nasce molti anni fa. Quando io ancora andavo a scuola, e la mia scuola era vicina allo studio di mia madre. Mia madre era una famosissima fotografa degli anni 40, 50, 60. Era specializzata in ritratti femminili, in foto di corpi, di femminili, di donne. E io quando finivo la scuola andavo da lei e stavo nello studio e vedevo come lei truccava le donne. Ancora c'ho nel naso l'odore del make-up dolciastro che usavano all'epoca. E poi come metteva la luce sul volto, sui corpi delle donne. E quindi io per anni ho visto queste donne belle, ben messe. Insomma, è stata una cosa che quando poi ho fatto il cinema ho scoperto che capivo le donne e magari avevo più problemi con gli uomini, con gli attori uomini. Non a caso uno dei film più importanti che ho scritto, che appunto C'era una volta il West, e la protagonista è una donna, era Claudia Cardinale, ed era il primo e ultimo film che Sergio Leone ha fatto con una donna, perché poi non ha più fatto film con donne. Forse è rimasto troppo sconvolto da quella esperienza.
Thanks. The theme of women is very important in my film. And it really it started many, many years ago. When I was just in school, my school was right near my mother's studio. My mother was a famous photographer in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and she was specialized in portraits of women. In doing women's faces, their bodies. So when at the end of the school day, I would go over to her studio and I would see her doing the makeup for these women. And I could still smell in my nose the sweetness of the makeup that used to be used back in those years. And I would see how she would light up their faces and their bodies. And they're beautiful women, really well dressed. They presented themselves well. So when I started making movies, I sort of discovered in myself that I really understood the women better. It was harder for me to work with men. That somehow, and so this is very important to me. And it's no accident actually that even before making this film, when I did the screenplay for Sergio Leone of Once Upon a Time in the West, notice that the protagonist of the lead is a woman, Claudia Cardinale. And it was after that, that was the first and only film that Sergio Leone made with a woman as a lead, because maybe he was just too disturbed by the experience.
I'm afraid we have to end it here. We have another screening starting shortly, but Mr. Argento, thank you so much for being here.